Hello, everyone. Uh, Thank you for joining us and welcome to the 24th edition of Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. On behalf of FLEFF, I welcome you all to this special event. This year is a historic year, as you all know. COVID, protests, masks, vaccines, remote learning, the Zoomiverse, the yearning for connections around ideas and community. And therefore, this year, for the first time in 24 years of its existence, FLEFF is 100% virtual. And we have two mottos this year for FLEFF. FLEFF, a different environment, and the other, we are the screen. We are delighted and honored that all of you from everywhere can join us in this event. My name is Raza Rumi, and I am the Director for Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College. And we are partnering with FLEFF this year on a variety of events that concern both media and society, and how people, not just in the US, but across the globe, are dealing with a very extraordinary situation. Our center, the Park Center, is dedicated to promoting media produced outside corporate control and to inspire and train the next generation of independent journalists in the traditions of Izzy Stone and many others before him. And that's why I'm very honored to welcome the Intercept Director of Communications and Strategy, Rodrigo Brandão, and one of the finest reporters in the country, Sharon Lerner, from the Intercept again. And let me say a few words about the Intercept, which is an independent, member-supported news organization, which holds the powerful accountable with in-depth investigations and analysis. Its journalists have been unveiling corruption and injustice across issues of politics, technology, criminal justice, the media, the environment, and much more. The unflinching approach to speaking truth to power extends across the Intercept's articles, podcasts, and videos, and its quality journalism has exemplified the power of independent media. And this is why we are very honored to have them with us. I would like to start with Rodrigo Brandão speaking a bit about the Intercept, its genesis, what it does, and how it is, as per our theme of FLEFF this year, infiltrating the news ecosystem, which is very much corporate controlled in the US. So over to you, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Raza. I appreciate it. So yeah, I think that your description of the Intercept was very on point. You know, as you said, we are a nonpartisan, independent, investigative journalism organization, really dedicated to holding the powerful accountable through what we call, adversarial journalism. Like, we publish in-depth investigations, analysis, and sometimes opinion as well, focused on politics, war, surveillance, criminal justice, the media, the environment, obviously, technology, and sometimes, even culture. I think that, we're part of sort of this media landscape of independent organizations, but we are also very unique from other nonprofit independent organizations. I guess you could put us in the same bucket as The Nation, or, a place like Democracy Now!, or even ProPublica. But I think we're also unique in our approach to politics and more, and technology and environment. And we, I think we encourage our reporters, like other organizations do, we're not alone in that, to really write with a sharp point of view, because we know that our readers are interested in that. They're interested in factual information, first and foremost, but also information that comes with a unique point of view. And they're interested in writers who are transparent about where they're coming from and what they believe in. And that's really the kind of journalism that we produce at the Intercept. Yeah, I don't know if I can go on and on talking about the Intercept, but it's, as you probably know, it was started about 7 years ago. It really kind of started as a national security organization. I think that the founding of organization really started with the Snowden archive and with the Snowden leaks. But we quickly expanded from that, and I think now we're covering a lot more of the national security issues, even though that continues to be an important beat for us. Just last year, we published, or the year before that, we published a big investigative series. We started an investigative series called the Iran Cables, which was a partnership with the New York Times, on the about sort of focused on the influence of Iran in Iraq and on the sort of national security intelligence games that Iran and the US play in Iraq. It was a really fascinating story and series that really came about with an unprecedented leak of more than 700 pages of security intelligence reports that we were able to access, that the Intercept was able to access, and then we shared with the Times on Iranian intelligence. So we continue to do that kind of work that's based on leaks, based on intelligence, always with this idea of that we want to bring transparency to government, to institutions, to the private sector, and to institutions that have a power over, our daily lives, our existence. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Rodrigo. That was a great introduction, but I will have more questions for you as we go along. And I'm sure our participants here in this webinar, they will also have questions for you and Sharon. And now over to Sharon. Sharon Lerner, if I may introduce her again, is an investigative reporter at The Intercept, who's been covering health, science, and the environment. Her work focuses on how corporate pollution impacts ordinary Americans, as well as failures within the environmental regulatory process. And some of her recent stories that we'll be talking about in this session concern these themes, in particular, how unchecked corporate greed is actually leading to loss of human lives and terminal illnesses. And before I ask Sharon to speak about her work, we'll show you a little clip from a video, and we are sharing the link in the chat box as well. And then I'll talk to Sharon about that particular video and the story that she's recently covered.
In the heart of two Texas towns sits a petrochemical plant. As a kid growing up here, Jill Pierce drove by it thousands of times.
So this is what we would drive through every morning and every afternoon on our way to and from school.
But until recently, she didn't know that the plant put a colorless gas into the air called ethylene oxide. And she didn't know that ethylene oxide causes cancer.
And every time I came to this area right here, I would just try to hold my breath.
This is Port Neches Groves, as we call it. Most of the people that live in this area work at those plants. But a man and a woman shouldn't have to sacrifice their life or their health to make a living for their family and put food on the table. And that, in many cases, is what these people are being asked to do.
We call ourselves the Lucky Seven because even though there's 8 of us in the group, we all say that we're lucky to have 7 best friends. When the first of our Lucky Seven group was diagnosed with breast cancer, she invited us all to dinner one night. She said, girls, the statistics are that 1 in 7 or 8 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer during their lifetime.
There were
Thank you. My colleague has just ended the video. So Sharon, this is such an amazing and powerful story. I mean, and also worrying at so many levels because it brings out both the failures in terms of environmental regulation, as well as the corporate greed, and how these human lives mean nothing for those who are in charge of making lives better for the majority of the public. And let me also add that I come from a developing country, quote unquote, and these stories always surprise and shock me because, these are things that go unchecked in many parts of the world. But one thing is that in the US, which is a old democracy, and has powerful and strong institutions of accountability and regulatory structures. And how come these things still happen, and how come these leakages occur? So we'd like to hear about this story, how you thought of it, how you investigated, and what were the hurdles in that investigation, because it was not an easy story after reading that and watching the video.
Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me today. I really appreciate it. So yes, so the chemical that I was writing about in that piece is ethylene oxide, and it's actually a chemical I've been following for a couple of years. There are, I feel like, many threads in my reporting at this point, but one of them has been following ethylene oxide, which is a petrochemical. It's made from natural gas liquids, and it is a carcinogen that is put out in near these plants, and there are a lot of them around the country. More than 50 that put out, I believe, more than 500 pounds, which is significant because of how potent a carcinogen it is. So previously, in the past, I have looked into how the majority of folks who are affected by this pollution are low income and communities of color. And you talk about, how we don't expect this here. And there are parts of the country where you're not going to find it, this kind of pollution. And that's part of what one of my first stories was about, which was that when there was ethylene oxide pollution discovered in a community called Willowbrook, which is the suburb of Chicago, that actually the regulatory process worked as you sort of hope it might, which is that the people in the community found out about it. The EPA, as soon as they kind of realized that this was a hotspot, they tended to them. They came and met with them. They met with people from the CDC. They met with their state regulators. They met with local regulators. They took to the streets, but they're in taking to the streets, they were responded to. And I think within about a year, that plant was closed down. So that community is overwhelmingly white. It is wealthy, relatively. When you look around the country at the other hotspots where this pollution is elevated, you don't see that kind of success. It's not. And in fact, most places that are affected by this, the people don't know it. So that community that you were in that video we were just watching a moment ago, that's Port Neches, the folks down there did not realize that they were exposed to elevated risk levels of pollution from this plant and of this particular carcinogen. And the EPA did actually reach out to some communities. And in one of my earlier articles, I had used the EPA data to show that there are 109 census tracts around the country where there is an elevated cancer risk, which by EPA's definition means that the risk of cancer over a lifetime of being exposed to a chemical is greater than 100 cancers in 1 million people. So using that definition, there are more than 100 census tracts, right? And overwhelmingly, the people in these places actually don't know it. So after our piece came out, the EPA Investigator General did a report saying, hey, EPA, you need to go to these communities where they are not aware of the risk and inform them. And this was during the Trump administration, and sort of remarkably, the Trump administration came back and said, no, we're EPA Investigator General, we're not going to do that. And so anyway, what you see here in this latest piece is a look at what happens, how people can find out about the pollution they face and what they can do after they find out about it. So it was about 2 places. One of them is Port Neches, that was just featured in that film clip. And the other is Lake County, Illinois, where a group of people that's about an hour from Willowbrook, which I mentioned, and folks there is a slightly lower income community than Willowbrook. And there's a lot of activism going on there. There's a very active group of people who have become aware of this pollution and are fighting it. but still their local polluters haven't been shut down. And also what they've realized, and one of the themes that came out in this piece was that, it's very hard to fight polluters, and it's very hard to fight your government, and it's very hard to take on this kind of an issue, especially when the pollution that you're talking about is invisible. So really one of the very few tools in their hands that people have at their fingertips is public records, which is, in the case of ethylene oxide, they look through an EPA database called the Toxic Release Inventory, or TRI. And in Lake County, they were using those records to try to hold their polluters accountable, figure out how much they're emitting and whatnot. And when they were doing this, in the process of doing this, they looked at the records and said, oh, okay, here's how much they emitted in 2016. I believe that was the year. Then they went back and they were getting a presentation ready to give to their neighbors, and they realized that the number that they had originally found on the website had changed, and it had been reduced significantly. And what my reporting shows, one of the things it shows in this piece is that around the country, many facilities did the same thing, that when it became apparent that this chemical ethylene oxide was more dangerous than previously thought and was going to cause both political and possibly regulatory problems for these companies, the companies actually changed their records. And not just that they started to report less, which has happened in a number of cases, but actually that they went back and retroactively revised the reports of pollution. And so that's one of the things I follow in the story. Anyway, it's a long one. I could keep going, but I'll let you ask some more questions.
No, thank you. I think it was really interesting. And for many who are present here, they would also be learning a lot on this. But, you've also reported on how the Environmental Protection Agency and has been sort of its role has been diluted under the former Trump, the former administration under President Trump. So tell us a bit about that. I mean, the kind of facts that you've uncovered in the process, and what particular methods have been employed to undermine the work of EPA, which is a very important agency, in so many aspects.
Well, I mean, it's really been across the board, and how an agency like that works is that you have career staff, you have scientists and others who just are in it for the long haul, and they work while the political winds shift. But then on the sort of upper levels, you have these political appointees, and those change. And we saw from the very top with the Trump administration that the people that were put in charge were exactly the people, basically represented the companies, the industries that were being regulated. So you had at the very top, first Scott Pruitt, then you had Andrew Wheeler, a former coal lobbyist. Scott Pruitt also very much coming from oil and coal, and coming from a history of suing the EPA repeatedly. And then the folks that they put in charge, and in the case of ethylene oxide, the people who were really important were in the Office of Air. And so you look at someone named Bill Wareham, who was in charge of the Office of Air for a long time, also total industry guy who had spent his career representing industry, trying to make it, basically fighting restrictions, and trying to and so we've seen this in the pesticides division as well. We've seen it, I mentioned, that there are other chemicals with air pollution, with one of the other big pollutants that is a cancer causer and you can see elevating those cancer risks I talked about is chloroprene. Another one is formaldehyde. Well, the Coke industries, which produces a lot of formaldehyde, the folks who were a former Coke employee ended up being involved in the regulation of that chemical. And you saw it really across the board. I just did a piece about a pesticide where they were supposed to be basically re-registering it, and instead of including all the studies that would have been appropriate. They like changed the search terms and only included a very small number, which allowed them to overlook all the risks. I just had a piece go up today, which was about another pesticide called paraquat. I don't know if you remember that pesticide, very hazardous. And you can see that over the past 4 years in particular, that as they're in the process of re-registering paraquat, that there are some of the evidence that should have been included and considered was swept under the rug. That's a complicated story. I would recommend that people go to the Intercept to read it. It is up now, but I fear that if I explain it, it'll take 20 minutes.
Yeah, we've just posted the link in the chat.
To the news story?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I request all those who are here, please do take a look or save the link and read it later. But, you know, I was very intrigued by, you know, how you brought in the issue of racial inequality into environmental reporting, you know, in a way, another dimension of racism, which is, i.e., environmental racism. And your work in 2020, you know, as you earlier mentioned, the tale of two toxic cities and other sort of inequities. Can you elaborate that a bit more on how it actually plays out in terms of different neighborhoods, communities, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I find it impossible really to write about environmental issues in this country without writing about racism. I mean, pollution in most cases is local, right? And we are a very segregated country, you know, the way we arrange our, you know, our neighborhoods, and the way that zoning works, and companies cite themselves in places where they where people who live there don't have the political power, time, or money to fight back. And then that ends up depressing property values, and it sort of turns into the snowballing effect. So it's very, very common to see that pollution of all kinds is disproportionately distributed. It's just sort of a fact of life here. And yeah, so that has been certainly a theme of my reporting since I've been covering these issues at the Intercept. And I would say it also became kind of a thread for many reporters, myself included, in covering the pandemic.
Right. Yes, exactly. I was coming to that because a lot of people wonder across the world as to why so many people are dead in the US compared to other advanced countries. I mean, more than 500,000, the number grows each year. It's tragic to even look at those figures. And your story in 2020 that looked at COVID deaths by zip codes in New York City, you know, so where, and a lot of people, especially outside the US, cannot really make sense until they read, you know, reporting such as yours and others, how class, race, housing, mobility, all these other factors impact how people survive and navigate the times of pandemic. So just talk a bit about that story, because I think that's a very important story. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, time has been so strange this year. It feels like a million years ago, sort of but I remember it was really the very beginning of the pandemic, and we had New York City was putting out these data tables of the rates of infection in different zip codes. And from the get-go, it was instantly distributed along lines of race and poverty. And like, the thing is, I have looked at these numbers before in reporting on health, right, in New York, and which is where I'm located. And so, and also I live here, so I know which, you know, what the map means. And it was just so striking from the get-go how similar these patterns were to when you look at homicide killings, your homicide deaths, or other, and then not coincidentally also when you look at other underlying conditions, which makes sense, right? Because then you began to see the deaths line up the same way that sorry, that's my son coming home. So it was very, very, very striking, and it wasn't hard to calculate either. It wasn't a matter of interpretation. The data was right there. So yeah, this was very early on, and thankfully lots of outlets began reporting this, but it was a consistent theme for us because it's a consistent reality. It's just throughout, whether it's been in terms of infections and deaths, or then later in terms of vaccine access, right? It's unfortunately been a very clear through line. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah. And talking about vaccines, I mean, another of your stories that dealt with how, the big pharma have been profiteering during the pandemic, and I guess they still are, given the high demand globally for vaccines. And I mean, there was that story about the Gilead Sciences, who were
about
granted the Gilead Sciences.
Gilead.
Who were granted the the orphan drug status for their drugs. So do talk a bit about that. And
that was insane, right? So of course, we knew from the beginning that this is a very, it's an important time for the pharmaceutical industry. We are relying on companies, and we're relying on this pre-established system. And of course, in many ways, in some important ways, the pharmaceutical companies have delivered in that we do have some effective vaccines now. And I don't want to discount that. But from the beginning, it also seemed clear that there was a bundle of money to be made, and that there are companies that were, while there are people at the companies who are really working hard on solving the scientific problems, there are also people who were locking down the profits very early, and not just the profits, but the profits at the expense of access. And so, which is inevitably what happens with, and you mentioned Gilead. So let me back up. So Gilead is a company that has actually been criticized widely for price gouging in the past. And they had a treatment for, they were marketing a treatment for COVID that was in the beginning of the pandemic or epidemic here in the United States. And as they were going through the approval process, the company basically managed to obtain orphan drug status for this drug. And this was, orphan drug status is a status given by the FDA to certain drugs that basically qualify as treating rare conditions. And a rare condition is defined as being less than 200,000 cases, right? And of course, COVID already, we certainly knew this was not going to be a rare condition, and they knew it too. But they went for it and got a orphan drug status, which, and I remember seeing it and not believing it. I don't know how I was researching this anyway, and then I sort of caught it the minute it happened, and wrote it up really quickly. And that was one of the rare happy moments of reporting on all this mess last year, because I think it was within a day or two, they reversed their position. And in part, I think because of the negative attention they got from people who are just sickened, literally, they were just outraged by the idea that this they would take advantage of this loophole because it allows them, and of course, orphan drug status allows you to profit more than you would in other cases.
Right. So I think I have a long list of questions, but I see that there are now many questions sort of piling up in the Q&A section. But before I go to those questions, I have one particular question because there are many students here with us this evening, and the process of story structure and storytelling. I mean, can you talk a bit about that? How do you conceive them, and how do you get on with the investigations? I mean, what are the kind of steps? I mean, do you follow a particular protocol, or it depends from story to story?
Well, good question. I guess I feel like I know that I'm supposed to outline and people are supposed to outline, and I guess you all should outline, and I feel that I should outline. I don't outline. I don't really have a process. It's a bit of a mess, but I mean, but I guess, to be fair to myself, what I try to do, and it's not even like, I know that readers care about people, and I care about people, and that's what people want to read about. So I feel that I'm obligated to summarize the boring stuff, the science and the reports and all the stuff, there are a lot of them, things that you need to move the story along to the things you care about, which is the people. So to the extent that I'm at all conscious of how I'm structuring it, I'm always trying to put the people front and center because I think they are and should be. So but it's not really helpful so much in terms of writing. I don't know. I feel that writing is hard and it's harder than I wish it were. I wish it were easier. I don't know, maybe other people find it easier. I don't know. I don't have a lot of tips on the writing part, except that for me, I do think it's really important to center the people, to give it emotional resonance, or nobody will care. Nobody will care about the hidden reports, except if they know what they're doing to people, and when I'm reporting, I want to talk to the Lucky Seven and hear what it did to this close group of friends. And then, I have to tell the story of the plant and the chemicals and do the calculations, but that's why you do it, or why I do it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That was a good answer. So we'll just, I think Jeremy has shared your story on the zip code one. So I'd really,
good.
Would like those who are present, maybe they can check it out later. So let me go to the Q&A and, start with some of the questions that we have. So Anne Michelle says, do you think there is such a thing as objective journalism? Wow, that's a broad one.
Well, I mean, and in short, I think that everybody always has biases, whether they recognize them or not. But I recognize that I write from a perspective, and I think that everybody writes from a perspective. I do certainly I want to be fair to everyone. I just wrote that piece that went up, an hour or two ago, is about Syngenta, the company that makes the pesticide paraquat, among other things, but it's about that. And, I included their perspective. Of course, I have to include their perspective, but it's part of understanding the bigger story to include what they think and say, which doesn't mean that I take their side.
Right. So we have another one. Yeah.
Oh, no, I just wanted to add that what I find interesting about that question is that, this term objectivity came into journalism from social sciences. And I think that the original intent of that was never to sort of, in the way that we understand it now, which is get two sides of the same story or what have you. I think that the idea was originally to to compensate for the biases of writers and of people. So it was always an understanding that people have bias, so we have to bring in science, we have to bring in methods, we have to bring in data to make the stories, quote, less biased. And I think now we know, obviously, the data and science, that those things have biases as well, that they have, you know, perspectives. And but I find it interesting that, you know, that we even changed this idea of what objectivity means, you know, because I think originally in the early 1900s, when we started talking about objective journalism, the idea was really to sort of bring in other methods to journalism that could sort of make it more reliable and verifiable.
Yeah, thank you for the addition. And we had a panel yesterday on this very topic of objectivity, and it was a book launch, The Roots of Fake News, and the authors completely demolished the idea of objectivity, saying how it has, it's just a very recent concept, but I think they are along the lines of what you just said, Rodrigo. So the next question is from James Beretta, who's a student here at Ithaca College, and he's saying, in what ways is the ethylene oxide dilemma a reflection of neoliberal methodologies that value profit over people?
Excuse me. Well, it is certainly what it illustrates. And yeah, I mean, this is the problem we're facing: profits over people, right? And so, and you know, our regulator, the EPA, our government has decided quite arbitrarily that one cancer in a million people is acceptable, right? But what we're talking about there is cancer, right? And why is it acceptable? It's acceptable because presumably the chemical is being used to produce something to, you know, as part of the economy, right? We're sacrificing basically that cancer, that one person's cancer is okay because we're making money, right? So that's sort of what it is. And then there's the idea, now it's 100 in a million, whatever the number is, that is the kind of the balance, the things that we're balancing against each other, health and profit. Yes.
Right. Okay. And here's a question for you, Rodrigo, because it's by Nick Macaluso, who's a student at IC, says, do you think the Intercept will ever introduce some sort of paywall?
Good question. Well, I think what's interesting to point out is that we don't have a paywall right now, and there are no plans to introduce one. I don't want to say ever, but like, you know, I think that the question of sort of how we sustain our journalism is an important one. And right now we have a membership program, and we really rely on donations from our readers to sustain and pay for our journalism. We need reader support. You know, we can't do the kind of journalism that Sharon and other reporters do without financial backing. So that's really important for us to understand that we do need support, and that we believe that that our journalism should be accessible to everyone. And it's because of that we don't have plans, and we don't want to introduce a paywall, because we think that it should be free and it should be accessible, and we don't want to create barriers for our audiences to read and you know, interact with our journalism. But you know, the question of funding is an important one, and that's why we have this membership program, and I encourage everyone to at least like sign up to our newsletters, and if you can, donate something to the Intercept. And really, I think that the basis of our membership program is based on the impact of our work, and that's really the currency that we talk about when we describe our journalism, and when we talk to our readers. We don't talk about exchanging money for articles. We talk about, you know, that by donating to us, they're creating an impact, a positive impact in the world. You know, we're exposing stories and, you know, injustices that are actually killing people, causing cancer in people. You know, exposing corruption in government and politics and in private companies. So that's really the impact of our work. And so we hope that readers understand the importance of that and continue to donate and support our work.
You're right. Thank you. Janet Walker has a question and that's for Sharon. Thank you for this crucial reporting. So far, you've spoken about the remediation of the pollution when successful in the form of shutting down the plants? Is there a way to operate the plant without emissions? Of course, that may not be your purview as a journalist, but just wondering, might we have to think our entire processing, manufacturing infrastructure in addition to remediating environmental racism?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it's different for different pollutants. And for ethylene oxide, it looks like the standard that came out from the EPA will make it pretty much impossible for many plants to operate without basically having their emissions be above the level that is safe. And so it really creates a bunch of dilemmas, right? So what should happen? I mean, for one, we need to think about the products that we're using. So one of the plants that, a plant that's in the process of being built now, they just did the modeling for its ethylene oxide emissions, which are go from this area about a half an hour from New Orleans, almost all the way to New Orleans in terms of elevated cancer risk. And it's a plastic production plant. And, so we have to think about the things that we use and what the impacts of the things we use are. So that's part of it for sure. And the other thing is, what happens when you do crack down on it? And so I was talking to a former industry consultant for some of these companies, and one of the chemicals that used to be, let me give another example, but basically one chemical that was cracked down on sort of recently, as a result, a bunch of the plants that emitted it went to Mexico. So like you solved a problem here and created it somewhere else. Not, there's that piece of it. But then there are ways that actually, when you force a plant to comply, you can sometimes, it's a matter of putting on more expensive equipment, and then it does. And so that actually happened with another chemical that was coming out of the same plant, Port Neches, which, was, they were putting out tons of it, was butadiene, and now they got their levels much lower because they were ultimately forced to. So, and that process took like 20 years. And I kind of think of that, having read about that and then thinking about where they are now with this chemical, my fear is that it could take another 20 years. But my hope is that in putting this article out and drawing people's attention to it, we can bypass that 20-year lag and maybe, find a way to do it much quicker.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer too. I know it was a complex question.
Yeah.
So before I go on to the next question, I just want to remind the participants that they may have seen it in the bios that Rodrigo Brandão, he's an alum of IC and he graduated in 2001. So welcome back in a different capacity. And Sharon Lerner got the IZZY Award in 2018 for her outstanding reporting, again, in the areas of environment and science. So I just wanted to highlight, because IZZY Award is one of the hallmarks of our center, which honors each year journalists and outlets who do outstanding work and contribute to debates and uncover inconvenient facts. So moving on to the next question, Jay Bradley. He says, when Jeremy Scahill came to Cornell, he declared Trump and his administration the American empire unmasked. To paraphrase, what have you found from your own reporting and your colleagues in reporting on the Biden administration with the mask back on, so to speak, so far? Ooh, tough question.
Yeah. So I hope I'm interpreting it correctly. So meaning, do we just trust? Do we trust this administration, and then we're not going to, And of course not. I mean no good journalist should be taking, the words of government to, certainly we already know that Biden doesn't have some of the problems we were seeing with Trump. There are some really, he hasn't, for instance, started an insurrection. There are a lot of clear improvements. But already I've reported on one of my first stories before he was even in office was that one of the people he put on his transition team for EPA was the guy who had overseen the defense of chemical for DuPont that I've written a lot about, this particular chemical PFOA, which is another toxic contaminant. And DuPont did an amazing job of spinning the EPA and managing to get out of what potentially could have been a lot of trouble by basically force and negotiation. And the person who led the company's defense of the chemical and it's, got it through that trouble, this guy, Mike McCabe, was the guy that Biden put on his EPA transition team. So that's not good, because we're looking to this administration to hopefully take up the stalled and failed work on this chemical that was done by the Trump EPA. So obviously, it is our job, journalists everywhere, to hold every administration accountable, and there'll be plenty of work to do in that department for this administration as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'd like to
yes.
highlight a quick thing too, is that
Please
one
do.
of the big stories that we did this year was that we published a private meeting between civil rights leaders and President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. It was a meeting right before, I believe it was right before right after Biden took over, but it was a private meeting where civil rights leaders were actually pressing Biden to take a series of actions in order to pass, to deal with racial injustice in this country, given what happened last year. And it was a meeting where Biden pushed back and, wasn't willing to take advice and to really say that he, and didn't commit to any, to taking executive action to deal with racial injustice in this country. And we published that video, and we did a series of reportings based on that video. So I think that we already from the get-go, we have been very adversarial towards the Biden administration as well. And we have shown that we're gonna keep the same standards that we had during the Trump administration with Biden.
Thank you, Rodrigo, for adding that important point. I just want to add 1.5 cents from my side for Jay. I think it's too early, Jay, to get to a more comprehensive assessment of what the Biden administration is doing or may do or may not do. I guess we'll have to wait a little bit more before getting onto that bandwagon. So the next question is by Alia Zahra, who says, do you think Biden administration's decision to make public Trump's political interference in science would help undo the damage to environmental protection in the US?
Give me a moment to make sense of this question.
Yeah.
Do I think that to make Trump's political interference, to make it public? So
Yeah.
meaning to acknowledge the monkeying around that's happened to the extent that they know about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, already I feel like I've, my past few stories, I've been dealing with press folks who are kind of still learning, I think, about where the bones are buried in terms of what happened, with that. So I think you shared that Talone assessment story. I don't think they were privy to a lot of these things. They weren't, A lot of this was happening with political appointees. So yes, we need them to be transparent about it, as they learn about it. But so far, I mean, like in my story, my ethylene oxide story, the press person ended up saying, okay, I was asking, okay, who at EPA was responsible for asking these companies to change their records? Because at least two of the companies told me that they were in fact invited by EPA to change their public records. And I said, who did this? And then they said, well, toxics office didn't do it. And I said, well, who else at EPA did this? And then they said, well, we don't know who did this, but the Biden administration moving forward will commit to, so they're kind of, I guess, happy in some sense to be able to pin some of these more embarrassing scandals on the outgoing administration, and then commit to, doing better themselves.
Right. And I have another question by Professor Zila Eisenstein, who asks, what do you think of the way the death narrative of cancer was displaced by COVID deaths and the impacts? Question mark.
I'm not sure. Meaning the death narrative of cancer, I guess do you mean that our attention was focused on that as one of the, tell me.
I think what it means is that, the focus on cancer got submerged or sidelined due to COVID deaths and the numbers, etc., while cancer is still prevalent. And as your stories show, lack of regulation and corporate greed is actually harming communities after communities. So I guess that's what.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's been very hard to keep focused on all the various problems we have during the pandemic, but certainly in the case of cancer and COVID, it's sort of one of those, and in terms of these communities that we're talking about that are inundated with pollution, often what you see is that those are the communities that are impacted most by COVID, and you saw this, actually, there were a number of studies that some of which I reported on that showed that air pollution interacts with COVID, which is to say that the places that it makes you more susceptible to the worst, to more severe cases, but also some of the pollution that we've talked about, the other chemical pollution. So air pollution interacts with it, but also PFOA that I mentioned is a part of a family of chemicals called PFAS. And we've seen that people who are exposed to that also tended to be particularly vulnerable to COVID. But I think what the question is more about, like, have we forgotten about the others when we're focusing on COVID maybe? And certainly I'm sure that's true to a degree.
Right, thank you. There's a question from Aaron Shields. The WTO and wealthy governments have chosen not to waive patents on vaccines. What do you think, or have you written anything about this?
I have, in fact, written a few stories about this. And let me think about what the first one was. So I have written about the struggle to get, one, I wrote about the TRIPS waiver, which is this effort that's happening within WTO to waive patent rights, right? And then I've written about the resistance to that, which is to say coming from the United States and the EU and I believe actually Brazil, strangely enough, where the companies are really resistant to do this because it'll cut into their profits, right? And so, and Li Fong, another reporter at the Intercept, has also been on this issue too. And then I published like maybe a month or so ago, I'll put it in the comments. I interviewed Archbishop of Cape Town about this, and he was really eloquent just about sort of how the inequity, the unequal distribution of vaccine was so much like apartheid to him. And I had another story that was actually called Vaccine Apartheid. But yes, it's absolutely, it's sort of the biggest story. It's what we're talking about, writ as large as possible, writ on the global scale, right? Is what we're seeing take place now with COVID drugs and vaccines and the global, maldistribution of them, for sure.
Right, thank you. I have another question, Sharon, and that's about your previous work on plastic pollution. And, I think that because that is something that I often talk about in my classes as well, in my international development courses. So you've also covered how Africa is endangered by plastic pollution, and with these trillions of pieces in our oceans and hundreds and thousands of tons floating deep or on the surface of the ocean. So tell us about that, your reporting, because that takes you away, way beyond the confines of the US, right? So
Yeah.
how difficult or how easy it is?
Yeah, that's been some of the most heartbreaking stuff to report on, really. So I did a couple of pieces on plastic. One was kind of about the machinations of the plastic industry and the chemical industry to kind of keep restrictions on them at bay, both basically internationally, and how that's evolved over the years, and some of the strategies they've used to deflect their responsibility for the costs of pollution, and in particular to deflect it onto individual consumers. So, and in that piece, I wrote about the Keep America Beautiful movement and their sort of historical relationship with beverage companies, in particular Coca-Cola, and how that has played out over the years quite successfully on their end, allowing them not to take any financial responsibility for the environmental and health costs of that pollution, which, as you mentioned, is basically everywhere. And part of the way they do that is to focus on these sort of voluntary, programs that involve, like, we're going to donate X amount of dollars, while at the same time quietly opposing all the efforts that would actually require things like responsibility for bottle bills and other kind of legislation that would actually make it possible to limit their pollution. So that was a very thorny one, and it really took me into the bowels of an ugly place, which is the plastic industry. And then I did do a piece in the beginning of last year? The beginning of last year about plastic pollution in Africa in particular. And that was really, again, some of the same schemes, but what you see is that in Africa, and I was in Kenya and Ethiopia in particular for that story, you really see that there is, in addition to the environmental crisis that we're all kind of familiar with, there's this human rights crisis that happens around this, where you have people around the world who are spending their lives sorting through plastic trash for pennies as a way of surviving. And there's, I spent some time at the Dandora dump in Nairobi for that story. And it was profoundly moving to talk to these people and realize that literally this is how they're spending their days. Obviously there are health issues and all sorts of, just, it's a terrible existence. But just that, one of the people I spoke to for that piece, who was running this organization to help the children who were growing up on that dump, who are like living there. And he had tried to get Coca-Cola to donate to help. And while they didn't give his organization money, they did offer to give them cold Coke in plastic bottles. And it just seemed to like sum up the irony and tragedy of the pollution problem there, and really in many other parts of the world, where we're letting them create this it's instantly pollution. It's instantly an environmental threat. And it costs nothing almost to produce, and yet it lingers for at least 100 years, hundreds of years. And it ends up really on the backs and in the throats and in the bodies of the poor and of everybody, but also very, very particularly and very literally, these people are submerged in it.
Wow. That's amazing, and I think that brings us to a close of this session. Thank you so much, Rodrigo and Sharon, for being here, for answering your question, many questions, difficult questions, so thoughtfully and incisively. And I also thank FLEFF for partnering with us and making this happen. And thanks to all those who attended. I know we all are experiencing Zoom fatigue everywhere in the world. So for those of you who've shown up, once again, thank you and goodbye.